Okay, we've been talking about different skeptical scenarios and how could we respond to the skeptic's challenge? How could we possibly show that we're not in one of these skeptical scenarios? What I want to do now is talk about a very, very famous sort of example. This is Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which is another kind of skeptical scenario. But here we have our first way of thinking about how to get out of the scenario, how to respond to the skeptic's challenge and show that we can have knowledge, right? Plato offers a response that can be thought of as a form of rationalism, where the way that we respond to the skeptic's challenge is by doing philosophy, by using reason and logic, right? So here's the general way to think about Plato's cave. You see this image here. Down here at the bottom, we have at the bottom of the cave, we have these prisoners that are chained to a wall. These prisoners are not able to turn their head and see what's on the sides or what's behind them. All they ever see are certain shadows on the wall in front of them. Now, these shadows are caused by other people behind them that are holding up different figures of like a bird, a tree, a vase, I guess. And so these shadows are the only thing that they've ever seen since they were born. They've been in this cave chained to the wall their entire lives. Very, very unfortunate creatures, right? But since all they see are these shadows, that's what they take to be real. That's all they've ever seen, so that's all they really know. How would they be able to know about anything else, like what's going on in the surface, what's in real existence, you might say, in the external world? They wouldn't know about all of this stuff because all they've ever seen are the shadows, these imitations, you might say, right? So these are supposed to represent the things that we see in our world. Plato thinks that we're like these prisoners in a cave that are chained to a wall, and all we can ever see are just mere shadows on the wall in front of us, right? So when you look at a table and chair for Plato, he thinks that that's like looking at shadows on a wall. They're not the true chair, they're not the true table, right? So we need to think about how can we get out of this kind of situation? How can we show that what we take ourselves to be seen in our world is are either shadows or not shadows? How can we get out of that situation? Right. So Plato thinks that the only way that these folks, these prisoners, could be released from the cave is if somebody comes down out of the surface level. They come down into the cave and they would have to release one of the prisoners. So the prisoners wouldn't be able to do it on their own, right? Instead, they would have to be released by someone else. Now, once they're released, they would not really want to leave the cave because they're used to their reality of being in the cave, looking at the shadows on the wall. So if the person drags them out, past the fire, they would see that, oh, it was the fire that was causing the shadows. And so if these are not real things. So they would start to get a better understanding as they're getting closer to the surface. But still, they would be reluctant because they would be leaving the only thing that they ever knew to be true. Nonetheless, if their savior, so to speak, continued to drag them further and further towards the surface level, well, then eventually, once they get there, they would see the true light of the sun. And the sun is supposed to be a metaphor for truth and goodness, right? Now, of course, once they got to the surface, they wouldn't be able to see very well because, just like when you leave a dark area and you go into the light, your eyes need to take a while to kind of adapt to the light. But after a while, you would get used to seeing things as they really are, and you would be living in the real world. Plato thinks that up here, out of the cave in the surface, you are amongst the forms. The forms are like the true things as they actually are. So you wouldn't have an imitation or a representation or a shadow of a tree or a bird or a vase. You would see the form of trees, the form of birds, the form of vase, the thing that is like unchanging and pure, right? So these are kind of like models or blueprints of all of the imitations of the things that you observed when you're in the cave. So up here amongst the forms, then you can do philosophy because you are now amongst what is real, what is true. Now, since you have been released and you're now living amongst the forms, you are becoming a philosopher. You're using reason and truth and logic, right? And so you could return back into the cave to release one of these other prisoners. And then, of course, the process would repeat itself. Would the same thing would happen to the other prisoner that happened to you. So that's kind of an example that Plato's using to illustrate uh, how a philosopher is educated, how they are taught, what it takes to become a philosopher, to have true understanding and true knowledge, to live amongst the forms in reality, right? Plato also has an interesting view of knowledge where knowledge is not really something that we learn, but instead it's something that we recollect. It's a form of memory. It's a form of remembering what we did when we were amongst the forms. For Plato, this is something that we did in a previous life, in a previous world where we once lived. We lived amongst the forms, and so the way that we learn, quote unquote, learn, is by remembering the time that we spent amongst the forms. And so, if you're a philosopher, when you're down here in the cave, you have to use your memory and remember what it's like to live amongst the forms. So that's one way of thinking about how we can respond to the skeptic's challenge. It's not something that we can do on our own. It's something that somebody else has to come down into the cave and help us leave the cave, where we can come to understand and grasp the form of goodness, the form of the truth, the form of beauty, the form of the trees and the tables and chairs, and so on and so forth. And that's through philosophy and through reason and logic and so forth.